We're speaking with Daniel Gordis, an Israeli author and scholar here at the Shalem Center in Jerusalem. And Israel is marking its 64th birthday, what they call Yom HaAtzma'ut, Independence Day. And Daniel, first of all, what are your reflections on Israel's 64th anniversary here? And are Israelis in the mood to celebrate?
Israelis always find a way to be in a mood to celebrate their birthday. As you well know, because you live here in Jerusalem, Israel precedes Yom HaAtzmaut, Independence Day. Immediately prior is Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day. Yes. And unlike Memorial Days in many countries around the world, which are a bit pro forma, and there may be some national ceremonies, but not a tremendous amount of intensive soul searching, as you know, Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day for fallen Israeli soldiers, is a very, very painful day here in Israel. The price that we have paid for our independence and for the rebirth of the Jewish people on its ancestral homeland has been an extraordinarily high price. As you know, on Channel 3, all throughout that day, for 24 hours, the names of 25,000 something young people who gave their lives will appear on the screen. And yet, when that day is over, we move immediately from a very sober, somber way of mourning to really great partying. So Israelis have learned...
It's like Americans having Memorial Day and then 4th of July back to back.
Right, except Memorial Day being much more somber,
yes,
and July 4th being even more joyous.
Yes.
It would be like moving, God forbid, from a very, very sad funeral to a New Year's Eve party,
yes,
I think. And Israelis have made almost an art out of finding a way to celebrate even in the middle of times that can be difficult. This has not been a bad year for Israel. We had the great success, the great joy of welcoming Gilad Shalit home, which really brought people literally out into the streets, dancing and singing. Thousands of people who'd never ever met him, who didn't know him, who didn't know his parents, really felt a tremendous success. So this will be the first Yom HaAtzmaut that Gilad Shalit is out in more than 5 years. It has been a year, of course, of some military confrontations here and there, but by and large, the borders have been quiet. And there is, of course, some degree of concern about what will happen in Egypt and what will happen in Syria. Iran remains a very dark cloud over the horizon. But this has been a pretty good and quiet year with some really wonderful moments. So I would say, yes, Israelis are very, very ready to celebrate, even as we recognize that we face great challenges ahead, which makes the friendship of you and your community all the more important to all of us.
You know, I think it may come from Jewish values. On your wedding day, the most joyous day of your life, you still break a glass to remember the destruction of the temple, that even in your biggest joy, you know, there's pain to remember, and even in painful times you can take joy and hope. But Israel was born in a conflict. There were people dying, and yet historically there was reason to celebrate that day in May 1948. After almost 2,000 years, the Jewish nation was reborn again.
Well, that's exactly right, David. What I think Yom HaAtzmaut is really about is the rebirth of the Jewish people. Now, the Jewish people never died and never disappeared. But if we were now in 1946, let's say, in January 1946, 1 year after the liberation of Auschwitz, and somebody said to you, as a person who is very educated, very bright, very worldly, tell me about the future of the Jews. And let's leave religious belief out of it for 1 second. If one just said to a general observer of the world in January 1946, tell me about the future of the Jews. Well, what would they have said in January 1946? If they look to Eastern Europe, the Jews are basically gone. 90% of Eastern European Jewry had literally been destroyed.
Yes.
Right? I mean, there were 4 million Jews in Poland before the war, 300,000 at the end of the war, and 10,000 now.
Decimated.
Decimated, completely gone. In the center of Europe, the further west you move, you go to places like Greece, where in Saloniki, every single solitary Jew was given over. You move to France, in which the French turned over even more Jews at times than the Nazis themselves had demanded. In England, they had survived the Blitz along with all the other Britons. They were completely shell-shocked also. Now, in the United States, where people tend to think, well, the Jews have always had it good there, and the Jews have been very secure and confident, let's remember this, that now once a year at least, on the third day of AIPAC's annual conference, when some 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 people, Jews and Christians alike, ascend the steps of Capitol Hill to go speak to their elected representatives about what they believe ought to be done, people ascend those steps, and the Jews among them certainly, with a sense of confidence. I'm an American. I can go up Capitol Hill and tell my elected official what I believe is important.
Yes.
But here's the question. How many people did that between 1938 and 1945? How many busloads of Jewish people went to Capitol Hill or to the White House to try to make their views known? Very, very, very few. There was one very famous march.
Did they feel they had the political clout then?
They didn't have the political clout, and they were much more, their acceptance in America was much more tenuous.
Yes.
So if we're in 1946 and you look at Eastern Europe, it's gone. You look at Central Europe, it's mostly gone. You look at Western Europe, it's been battered. You look at the United States, Jews are not the Jews of 2012. They are very, very different. And there's only one other place in the world where there's a significant number of Jews. It's a place called Palestine back then. And there were British troops patrolling the shores, as you well know, making sure that Jews who had nowhere else to go, there were boatloads of Jews that no country would take, and the British didn't even let them in here. And so in 1946, if somebody said to you, tell me about the future of the Jews, you'd have to be pretty sober, and you'd have to say, it doesn't look good. And look where we are now in 2012. There is a rebirth of Jewish life, not only in Israel, on the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, but American Jews have come out of the woodwork with a tremendous sense of confidence and pride. The Jewish people really has, in a profound way, been reborn, and we understand that that rebirth is thanks not only to God's caring about God's covenant with the Jewish people, but also because of the revival of the state of Israel. And so yes, there is no way to go into Yom HaAtzmaut without recognizing that we have a tremendous amount to celebrate and a tremendous amount to be grateful for.
It does seem, though, there's this constant challenge that Israel came into being as reborn as a nation state in 1948. The next year it was accepted into the United Nations, and yet there's this constant effort to delegitimize Israel, to undermine the legitimacy of Israel's existence and say, let's go back to some binational state, no Jewish state.
That's true. I mean, one of the great ironies of the current situation in which Israel finds itself is that militarily, if we leave Iran out of the equation for a moment, militarily Israel's not in any real danger. I mean, there will be conflicts and battles here and there, and God forbid young Israelis will fall defending their country. But Egypt is not going to destroy Israel, and Syria is not going to destroy Israel. Lebanon can barely keep itself going. It's not a danger. We have a peace treaty with Jordan. Militarily, except for Iran again right now, we're reasonably secure. But as you correctly point out, that doesn't mean that we don't face very grave challenges. Now the challenge is not the challenge of the battlefield, it's a battlefield of ideas. Yes. Now the weapon is not the tank or the airplane, now the weapon is words and keyboards. And
flotillas.
Exactly. And now what we basically understand is that having recognized that they can't destroy the Jewish state, Israel's enemies have decided to undermine the idea of the Jewish state. And what they say is that basically the nation state, the idea of a country which is devoted to the flourishing of a particular people, a particular religious heritage, a particular national heritage, a particular history and memory and way of life, that idea is a bad idea. Look at the European Union. The European Union is trying more than many people think it should to erase borders, to erase the differences between cultures, to make one international language, one currency, and so forth. Now, economic hard times are making things very shaky for the European Union, but the idea of the European Union is precisely the opposite idea of Zionism. Zionism says that human beings flourish best when my culture, my tradition, my language, my religion, my heritage is the language and the culture and the tradition that I live in. And you should live within yours, and they should live in theirs. And it's not that mine is better than yours or yours is better than theirs. We are all going to be better off when we watch how the other worships God.
Strength in diversity.
Absolutely. And basically that diversity is becoming something that's very much endangered in the international community today. And because Israel represents that idea, it is on the receiving end of much of the world's opprobrium. Throw into that, of course, the fact that the Palestinians have masterfully turned the fact that they are the ones who refuse to negotiate with Israel somehow into an accusation against Israel for not being flexible enough. And you do face a very serious challenge. Israel is being delegitimized in the international community, and that is the major battle that we have to wage right now.
And do you think the government's making headway in meeting this challenge?
I think the government of Israel is beginning to understand the enormity of the challenge. I think that the government of Israel is doing better than it did. I believe it's not doing nearly well enough. Partly, Israelis don't live in the West. Even Benjamin Netanyahu, who was educated in the West and grew up in America and so forth, doesn't, I believe, fully have his finger on the pulse of what's changing. And the world in the United States has become so hostile, so irrational, and so illogical that it's hard for many rational, logical, sensible human beings to wrap their arms around how bad things have really gotten there. So I think there's a tremendous amount of much more work that needs to be done on the part of the Israeli government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and so on and so forth, to begin to take on this challenge.
There's a new poll out that says 40% of Europeans surveyed in several European countries, 40% believe that Israel is carrying out a policy of extermination against the Palestinians. And the word they use, when they use exterminate, they deliberately use that word to try and see if people had anti-Semitic views. And according to the poll, if you felt that way, you were anti-Semitic.
Yeah, well, the word extermination is meant to do something else, of course, David, as you know, which is to evoke images of Nazi savagery.
Exactly.
And the idea is that as Europe has gotten tired of being blamed for what happened between 1934, let's say, and 1945, and the extermination of 1/3 of the world's Jews, there's a kind of a subtle response here, which is, well, if the Israelis are doing it also, then it's time to let Europe off the hook. Who are the Jews to start lecturing us about the Holocaust if the Jews themselves are doing it? Now, you and I both understand that the accusation is absurd. Nobody's being exterminated. Hardly any Palestinians have been killed in the last few years. But even if there had been conflicts in which many people had died, God forbid, the word extermination is a horrible word. You're right, Europe has literally lost its mind. And in addition to the poll that you so correctly cited, it's interesting also to cite another poll. Europeans cite Israel, as the country that is the most dangerous to world peace. Israel is more dangerous to world peace than a nuclear North Korea. Israel is more dangerous to world peace than Iran that wants to get a nuclear weapon. Israel is more dangerous to world peace than China, for example, which is rattling its saber all around. Israel, this tiny little country the size of New Jersey with a population less than that of greater Los Angeles, it's the most dangerous country to world peace. In other words, there's something so myopic about what's happening in Europe that you're right. Israel is the recipient of a tremendous amount of simply baseless hatred. And I have to say, it's a tremendously painful thing to say, that it's not the first time that the Europeans have turned their sights of hostility and hatred on the Jews. They don't say it in terms of race anymore, and they don't speak in terms of theology anymore. Now they simply say that the idea of the nation state is a bad idea, so the Jews that have a nation state should get out of the nation state business. But it's really the same virus, David. It's the same hatred of the Jew. Once it was theological, once it was racial/scientific, now it's nationalism. But it's a very painful thing to be in the year 2012, 64 years after the creation of the State of Israel, some 67, 68 years after the end of the Holocaust, and to watch Europe engaging in a pile-on against not just the Jewish state, but the Jewish people once again. It's a very sad thing.
To put this in biblical terms, I know you're a man of biblical faith yourself, that the Bible talks about a spirit of strong delusion coming over people. I think that's what came over Europe with Hitler. They got so charmed by him that they would, whatever he wanted to do, they went along with it. And what you're describing here is a world heading that way.
You're right. The Bible does speak about the spirit of delusion coming over people, and that is what we are witnessing. But the Bible also speaks about a promise to Israel,
yes,
and a promise of Israel. And the Bible does speak about a covenant between God and the Jewish people that can never be severed.
Yes.
And I'll say to you, for me personally, one of the things that's most profoundly moving about living here as somebody who grew up in the United States is to be part of the fulfillment of this covenant. In other words, the covenant means that God does God's work and we do our work. The Hebrew phrase, "V'shavu banim ligvulam," and the sons will return back to their borders. And all of the images from Isaiah, from Jeremiah, from Ezekiel, in which God describes a future for the Jewish people of Torah going forth once again from Zion. And there is more Torah being studied here now than there was in Poland even before the war. We have rebuilt. We carry very deep scars. We engage, today is Yom HaShoah when you and I are speaking, and Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaZikaron are coming up soon. We have many, many scars that we continue to carry. We carry many memories with us. We have a lot of pain. But we do understand, at least people like me believe, that what we are witnessing here is also the fulfillment of a divine promise. That God's care and love for the Jewish people does not end. That the future of the Jewish people certainly is robust and filled with tremendous promise. And that the Jews and others of faith around the world can bring about a much better humanity, all of us by living through the prophecies that we believe that God gave.
So despite Israel's many wounds and many challenges, there is reason to look forward in hope, and there's reason to celebrate at Israel's 64th birthday this year. This is David Parsons with Daniel Gordis of the Shalem Center here in Jerusalem.